In the heart of the Iron Claw Pack, the air was thick with the scent of pine, damp earth, and the metallic tang of impending change. It was the night of the moon binding, the most sacred ceremony in the lunar calendar, where the Alpha would publicly choose his Luna and solidify the pack's future. To any outsider, the scene was one of majestic tradition, but for Elara, it was a slow-motion execution of her heart. Elara stood at the very edge of the clearing, her fingers twisting the frayed, soot-stained hem of her tunic. She was an Omega, a glitch in the pack's proud warrior bloodline. Her wolf was so silent, so profoundly absent, that the pack elders had long ago claimed it had died in the womb. To them, she was a broken vessel, a servant whose only value was her ability to mend the clothes and heal the wounds of the real wolves. She was the one who scrubbed the blood of battle from the floorboards while the warriors feasted above her head. Beside her stood her sister, Lyra. Lyra was everything Elara was not. A high-ranking warrior with a scent of ozone and cold steel that commanded respect. Lyra's wolf was a massive gray predator, and tonight she wore a dress of crimson silk that looked like spilled blood against her tan skin. She didn't look at Elara. No one did. In their world, to acknowledge an Omega was to invite the taint of weakness. For 3 years, Elara had lived a double life. She had been Alpha Kael's secret comfort. It had started on a rainy night when he returned from a border skirmish, bleeding and exhausted. While the healers were busy with the high-ranking officers, Elara had quietly tended to him in the dark. From that night on, the quiet, shadowed hours belonged to them. Kael would come to her small cabin, his alpha facade dropping the moment the door closed. He had whispered promises of a future against her skin, calling her his hidden moon. He had bandaged her bruises and told her that strength wasn't just about the shift. Elara had believed him. She had given him her heart, her trust, and her body, waiting for the day he would finally stand before the pack and claim her as his own. As the full moon reached its zenith, casting a silver pall over the gathered crowd, Kael stepped onto the sacred rock. He was a mountain of a man, his bare chest scarred from 100 battles, his eyes like polished obsidian. The pack went silent, the only sound the crackle of the massive bonfires. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. This is it, she thought. Tonight, he tells them. Kael's voice boomed, vibrating through the clearing. A pack is only as strong as its foundation. A king needs a blade at his side, not a burden to carry. We face dark times, and the Iron Claw cannot afford the weight of the weak. He reached out into the crowd, and for a fleeting second his eyes met Elara's. She offered a small, hopeful smile. But Kael's gaze turned to ice. He looked right through her, as if she were made of glass. Instead, he grabbed Lyra's hand, hoisting it high for all to see. I reject the weak blood of the Omega. I claim Lyra, the daughter of the North, as my Luna. Together we will breed a generation of Alphas that will tremble the earth. The pack erupted in a deafening roar of approval. It was a sound of triumph that felt like a physical blow to Elara's chest, knocking the wind from her lungs. The secret bond she thought they shared, the soul tether she had nurtured for 3 years, was severed with a single, cold sentence. Kael finally looked down at her, his lip curling in a sneer of performative cruelty to satisfy his warriors. Don't look so surprised, Elara, he called out, his voice dripping with a mock pity that felt worse than a slap. You can't even shift. You are a ghost. How could a ghost ever lead a pack of predators? You were a temporary distraction, a place to rest my head, but a king needs a queen who can hunt. You were never meant for the throne, Omega. The crowd turned as one, their faces twisted in mockery. Laughter, jagged and sharp, echoed through the clearing. Omega! Omega! They chanted, the word a slur meant to remind her of her worthlessness. Her stepmother, standing near the front, spat on the ground in Elara's direction, Lyra looked down at her sister with a smirk of pure victory, her eyes glowing with the amber light of her wolf, mocking Elara's humanity. Elara felt the world tilting. The betrayal was a silver blade to the heart, twisting in the wound until she felt her spirit beginning to fray. She stumbled back toward the tree line, but the pack members blocked her path, shoving her back into the center of the clearing so they could witness her humiliation. "Look at her!" Kael shouted, wanting to prove his strength by crushing his former love. "Look at the weakness we have purged from our future." But as the mockery reached a fever pitch, something deep within Elara, something that had been suppressed for 21 years, began to stir. It wasn't the silence of death. It was the silence of a seal. The sheer, agonizing pain of the rejection acted as a key, turning in a lock that had been forged by the moon goddess herself to protect a power too great for a mere pack to contain. The ground beneath Elara's feet began to tremble. Not a small vibration, but a violent heave that knocked the nearest warriors off their feet. A low hum vibrated through the air, a frequency so ancient and heavy, it made the elders' hair stand on end. The fires, once roaring orange, suddenly flickered and turned a deep, ethereal violet. "Kael," Elara whispered. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through the chanting like a thunderclap. Kael laughed, stepping off the rock toward her, his hand raised as if to strike her away. "Go back to your hut, Elara. You're embarrassing yourself. You have no wolf, no power, and now, you have no protector." "I am not a ghost," Elara said, her voice growing deeper, resonant with a power that seemed to come from the very core of the planet. Her skin began to glow with a faint, silvery light. "I am the storm you were too small to weather. You didn't reject a burden, Kael. You rejected the moon itself." A blinding, prismatic light erupted from Elara's skin, white-hot and terrifying. The wolves in the front row screamed, shielding their eyes as the heat of 1,000 suns radiated from the small Omega. Her bones didn't just shift. They sang a song of destruction and rebirth. The sound of her transformation wasn't the wet snap of muscle, but the sound of tectonic plates grinding together, of mountains rising from the sea. She didn't shift into a common gray wolf. She didn't even shift into a large alpha. As the light faded, a creature of myth stood in her place. She was a celestial dire, twice the size of Kael's wolf, her fur shimmering like crushed diamonds and stardust. Massive wings, feathered in silver, tucked tight against her powerful flanks, and a crown of bone grew from her brow. Her eyes were vast, swirling galaxies of violet and gold. The sheer weight of her aura was a physical force. It wasn't just dominance, it was divinity. One by one, the warriors of the Iron Claw felt their knees buckle. The instinct to submit was so overwhelming, so primal, that even Lyra fell to the dirt, her warrior spirit crushed under the weight of a true goddess. Kael stood frozen, his face pale with a terror he had never imagined. He tried to growl, but his wolf was whimpering inside him, begging for mercy. Elara's wolf stepped forward, her massive paws cracking the sacred stone of the clearing with every step. She let out a roar that shattered the glass windows of the nearby longhouse and sent a shockwave through the forest that could be felt for 50 miles. The pressure in the air became unbearable, a divine command that demanded total obedience. With a guttural whimper, Kael, the man who had just called her a burden, collapsed into the mud. He didn't just kneel. He pressed his forehead into the dirt in a gesture of total, absolute submission, his body trembling with the realization of what he had thrown away. The pack followed suit, hundreds of wolves bowing their heads to the Omega they had mocked. Elara shifted back, her human form now wreathed in a faint, ethereal glow, her hair white as frost, and her eyes remaining a haunting violet. She walked through the rows of kneeling wolves, her presence like a silent flame. She stopped in front of Kael, lifting his chin with the tip of her toe, forcing him to look at the ghost he had rejected. Tears of terror and regret streamed down his face. "You wanted a stronger Luna," she said, her voice echoing with a power that made the trees bow. "But you were too small to even stand in my shadow. You didn't reject me, Kael. You failed me. And now, you will watch as I take the world you thought you were fit to rule." She didn't stay to hear his pleas for forgiveness or the sudden, desperate declarations of love that began to pour from his lips. She turned her back on the pack that had mocked her, walking into the night as the forest itself sang her name. She wasn't just a Luna. She was the end of their era. And they would remain on their knees until the moon itself faded from the sky. As she reached the tree line, a massive white wolf, even larger than her own form, emerged from the darkness. It was Alpha King Malachi of the ancient peaks, a man who had been searching for the celestial dire for 500 years. He didn't kneel. He bowed his head in respect, and for the first time in her life, Elara felt a bond that wasn't a secret. It was a destiny. "I found you," the king whispered, his voice like the wind. Elara looked back at the iron claw pack one last time. They were still on their knees, pathetic and small. She turned to the king and smiled. "Let's go. I have a world to reclaim." The journey to the ancient peaks was a blur of high-altitude winds and silent understanding. By the time the sun rose, they reached the Citadel of Frost, a city carved directly into the living rock of the highest mountain. This was the seat of the High Council, a group of 7 alphas whose lineages went back to the dawn of time. They were warriors who had never known defeat, and as Elara stepped into the council chamber, she could feel their skepticism pressing against her like a physical weight. Malachi took his seat on the central throne, but he did not speak. He watched as the High Alpha of the Southern Ridge, a man named Valerius, stood up. Valerius was covered in scars and carried an aura of pure, unadulterated aggression. He looked at Alara's simple, tattered tunic and snorted. "You bring us astray from the Iron Claw, Malachi? You claim the celestial dire has returned in the form of an Omega who smells of coal and rejection?" The other council members murmured in agreement. "She has no scent of a leader," another added. "She looks like she would break in a summer breeze. If this is our prophecy, then our enemies will feast on our remains." Elara felt the familiar sting of judgment, but this time it didn't hurt. It fueled the fire. She walked into the center of the room, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She didn't wait for permission to speak. She looked Valerius in the eye, and her violet gaze flared with a light that made the council members recoil. "You speak of scents and appearances," Elara said, her voice resonating with the same cosmic power that had leveled the Iron Claw clearing. "But you are blind to the marrow. You think strength is a loud growl and a heavy fist. I have endured 20 years of your kind's strength, while I carried the weight of a dying goddess in my veins. I am not astray. I am the reason you still have a world to argue over." Valerius roared, his ego bruised by the words of a girl. He shifted mid-air, a massive black wolf lunging at her with claws extended. The council gasped, expecting Elara to be shredded, but she didn't even flinch. As Valerius reached the apex of his jump, Elara simply raised a hand. A wave of violet energy, dense as liquid lead, slammed into him, pinning him to the floor before he could land. He shifted back into human form, gasping for air under the crushing pressure of her aura. "Do not mistake my mercy for weakness again," Elara whispered, the wings of her true wolf shimmering momentarily behind her like a spectral shadow. "I have just ended one alpha's reign. Do not make me end yours." The room fell into a silence so deep it felt like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Malachi stood up from his throne, his eyes filled with pride. "The council has seen enough," he declared. "Elara is not a Luna to be chosen. She is the sovereign to be followed." One by one, the 7 high alphas lowered their heads. Months passed, and the Citadel of Frost thrived under Elara's celestial light. But far below the mountain peaks, the Iron Claw pack was dying. Without Elara's hidden healing presence, their wounds festered. Without her luck, their hunts failed. And now a new terror had emerged, the Shadow Stalkers, ancient creatures of the void that fed on wolfkin. One winter morning, the heavy iron gates of the citadel groaned open. A group of bedraggled, broken wolves limped into the courtyard, their fur matted with dried blood. At their head was Kael. He looked like a shadow of his former self, his alpha status stripped by defeat, his eyes haunted by grief. Beside him, Lyra was barely conscious, her arm bandaged in filthy rags. They were brought before the high throne. Elara sat beside Malachi, draped in white furs and silver jewelry, looking every bit the goddess she had become. Kael stared up at her, his voice trembling as he broke the silence. "Elara, please. The Shadow Stalkers have taken half the pack. We have nowhere left to go. I was a fool. I was a monster. But please, do not let our children die for my sins." He threw himself onto the cold stone at her feet, sobbing openly. Lyra, too weak to stand, slumped beside him. The High Council looked to Elara, their faces hard. "They mocked you, Sovereign," Valerius reminded her. "They left you in the ash." Elara looked down at the man who had broken her heart, and the sister who had enjoyed it. For a long moment the only sound was the howling wind outside. Then Elara stood. She descended the stairs, stopping just inches from Kael's bowed head. She didn't touch him. "I do not help you because you deserve it, Kael," she said, her voice like soft thunder. "I help you because, unlike you, I do not fear the weak. And unlike you, I do not forget my own blood." The battlefield was a frozen wasteland of shadow and bone. The Shadow Stalkers were nightmare entities, shifting masses of darkness with glowing red eyes. They had cornered the remains of the Iron Claw against a cliffside, their jagged claws ready to finish the slaughter. Kael stood at the front, his sword broken, preparing for his final stand. Suddenly, the sky didn't just brighten, it ignited. A roar echoed from the heavens as the legions of the ancient peaks descended on wings of light. At their center was Elara in her celestial form. She didn't use teeth or claws. She moved like a living supernova. Every time she flapped her wings, a pulse of pure lunar energy disintegrated the shadows. The stalkers shrieked as they were burned from existence. Malachi fought beside her, a blur of white fur and steel, protecting her flanks as she cleansed the valley. In minutes, the darkness was gone. The survivors of the Iron Claw stood in the silent, shimmering snow, looking up at the goddess who had saved them. Elara descended, shifting back into her human form as her feet touched the ground. She walked past Kael, who was trembling with awe, and went straight to the wounded children of the pack. She placed her hands on the ground, and a wave of warmth spread through the snow, sealing their wounds and bringing color back to their faces. "The Iron Claw pack is dead," Elara announced, her voice carrying across the valley. "But the people of the Iron Claw can live. You will come to the citadel. You will be servants to no one. But you will remember this. Strength is not the power to reject, but the power to protect." She looked at Kael, whose eyes were full of a love and regret that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She didn't take him back. She didn't need him. She walked toward Malachi, who reached out and took her hand. They walked away together, the king and the celestial queen, leaving the broken Alpha in the shadows of the world they were about to remake. Hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss anything from us.